Hello everyone, my name is Andrew Brandenburg, and today I'll be talking a little bit about some social psychological phenomenon and concepts that we can find in popular media. Specifically today we'll be looking at NBC's 2009 through 2015 sitcom called Parks and Recreation. I'm a big fan of the show, and it contains plenty of examples of some of the topics that we'll be covering today. Before we get too much into it, let's just talk a little bit about the show, kind of give an overview of the setting we're looking at. The show itself, it's kind of set in this realistic bureaucratic setting. It's realistic enough. It's a sitcom, so there are, of course, some kind of more fantastical elements, some exaggerated reactions and personality traits. There are 7 seasons. The whole show is set in the kind of late 2000s, early 2010s. There's a handful of main characters, plenty of people to look at that we'll talk about, and it's set in kind of this natural real-world environment with several interest groups and kind of overlapping relationship matrices and all kind of opportunities for conflict and for psychological phenomenon to take place. The story itself is the adventures and misadventures of just these local government workers. There are 10 or more characters in the main group, depending on the season that you're watching. Each of them have very strong and varied personalities. The kind of main character, if there was one, is a character named Leslie, who we'll talk about in a moment, and we kind of follow her journey throughout this bureaucratic world. There are so many character conflicts and interactions and different interest groups, like I mentioned, which really pave the way for all of these phenomena to take place, which is why I chose this show for this project. Now, the way that this will work in terms of the format of this presentation, I'm going to present kind of this larger idea within social psychology, and then we'll break it down into these more nuanced subfacets as they apply to a specific character. For instance, we're going to start with social cognition here. Social cognition is just kind of the nebulous term for the various mental processes that we use when we try to perceive, interpret, and kind of understand and make decisions in our social environments. We're going to talk a little bit about biases, comparisons, and heuristics. Starting with biases, we have this thing called the spotlight effect, which is this phenomenon that occurs in which we tend to overestimate how much other people are paying attention to us. If I go out in public with a stain on my shirt, I may believe that everyone is paying attention to the stain on my shirt, when in reality, maybe 25 to 30% of the people that I assumed were actually looking. When it comes to comparisons, we have this phenomenon of the upward comparison, which is the opposite of the downward comparison, obviously. Upward comparison is simply when we kind of compare ourselves to others who we perceive as being superior in some way to us. If I'm jealous of somebody's style, I may make an upward comparison to them, saying I should be more like them, or I wish I was more like them. Lastly, there's this thing called the illusion of transparency, which is one of many, many illusions and kind of biases that can occur in this kind of category. And this is simply the overestimation of how easily others can perceive what we think and what we feel. This is very common. If we're upset about something, we assume that others know that we're upset. Not always the case. A great character to look at when we're talking about social cognition is this character named Craig Middlebrooks. He's vivacious and he's volatile. He's very high energy, kind of this dangerous vibe about him, but overall kind of a pure character here. A good example of the spotlight effect occurs in season 6, episode 19. In this episode, some of the gang is attending a sommelier competition, kind of, becoming professional wine tasters. And Craig, it's very obvious, is dealing with, imposter syndrome or the spotlight effect. He assumes that people know he doesn't belong, and he's kind of desperate to prove that he knows his stuff, when in reality, no one really cares. He paid the fine, and he's there just like everyone else is. When it comes to upward comparisons, there's this thing that happens in season 7, episode 3. April is another character in the show, and she's kind of struggling with her life plan for herself. She's not really content with where she is, but she doesn't know where she wants to go. And Craig has this kind of moment of transparency with her in which he reveals that he holds her in very high regard. He's very jealous of the accomplishments that she's made so far and kind of her natural gifts. And this is a good example of upward comparison because it's an expression of jealousy, but it is in a positive aspect. Craig wishes he was more like April. Lastly, when we're talking about the illusion of transparency, Craig, as always, is a very emotional and very neurotic person. There's a very emotional, stressful moment in this episode called New Slogan in season 6, in which he is so stressed and worked up, he storms off screen, and then he comes back like a minute later and he says, "Somebody follow me, I'm distraught." And he's very upset that others didn't realize how upset he was. And I think that's a perfect example of the illusion of transparency because people didn't really know what he wanted until he communicated it with them. But he assumed that they could see right through him. We're going to move on to the topic of self-justification, and this is simply a collection of processes that we use in attempts to rationalize or justify our beliefs, our behaviors, our attitudes, really anything, even if these beliefs and behaviors kind of conflict with evidence or reality or social norms. When we're talking about this, there is a big theory in this category called effort justification theory, which posits that really the more work we put in towards an achievement, the better that achievement feels to us. You know, working hard kind of makes the effort worthwhile, so to speak. There's this other thing called cognitive dissonance that occurs in which, if we hold one belief that conflicts with another, or if we are made to do something or feel that we have to do something that conflicts with our beliefs, this can lead to kind of this internal clash. This will very often lead to irrational behavior and stress overall. And lastly, another thing that we look at in this category are just excuses for cruelty. How do we justify cruel actions towards others? And we discover that acts of cruelty and unfairness, they're easier to commit against others if we feel that the victim deserves it. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we look at Leslie Knope. Now, Leslie Knope, if there was a main character, it certainly is Leslie. It's her show. She's determined and she's driven. But she very often is kind of not quite stubborn, but really unwilling to hear no. She's so driven and so focused on her goals that she ends up always coming out on top in the end. And I think she's a great example of some of these self-justification practices. When it comes to effort justification, there's no better summarization of this than what we hear in towards the series finale. She's giving a very heartfelt speech, and she quotes Teddy Roosevelt as saying that the best price that life has to offer is a chance to work hard at work worth doing. And I think that really summarizes very succinctly the ideas behind effort justification, that, the work in and of itself is a prize because it gives value to the end goal that you're working towards. When we talk about cognitive dissonance, we can look at Leslie and Ben's entire arc. Ben is another character, another major character in the show, and he's Leslie's primary love interest throughout most of the series. However, in the beginning stages of their relationship, when they're still, in that will they, won't they phase, so to speak, there's this great conflict. Leslie is a very morally upstanding person. She very much believes in the rules. She's very much a stickler. And there's this rule in their local government that you're not allowed to be romantically involved with your boss. Ben is her boss. She has feelings for Ben, and this leads to all kinds of internal conflict with Leslie. Eventually, they have to choose one over the other, but I won't spoil that for the audience here. And then lastly, when we're talking about excuses for cruelty, Leslie is notorious for her hatred of her neighboring town called Eagleton. They're kind of rival towns. One is rich, one is poor, one is great, one is bad, depending on who you ask. And Leslie, who is otherwise a very morally upstanding do-gooder, she has no problem committing these acts of cruelty as long as it's against the Eagletonians. She's all about the people and the parks and kind of giving back to society. And in one episode, she literally encourages her employees to dump trash over a fence into a children's park simply because it's Eagletonian. And I think that's a great example of how cruelty and acts of aggression are made easier if we believe that the other party deserves it. Moving on to conformity. Conformity is simply the practice of altering our beliefs or our actions to kind of fit within a group or fit within a social norm. We'll talk a little bit about that here. Within conformity, there are several different flavors and the kind of subcategories of conformity. We're going to talk about compliance. Compliance in itself is conforming or agreeing with what we're told to do without really truly believing in what we're doing. This differs from obedience or acceptance because it's more we still hold our own beliefs, but our actions don't match. Descriptive norms simply are beliefs that we hold about what others think or do. So these kind of norms can apply pressure towards us, kind of encourage us to conform because of what we believe others believe, so to speak. It's this perceived other. And then lastly, reactance is simply the protection of our freedoms. This is often expressed as disobedience, noncompliance, whatever you want to call it, acts of rebellion. And this is behaviors that we kind of act out in effort to protect our own freedoms, like I mentioned. Now, those of you who know the show may be surprised that I chose Ron Swanson to be my character that I discuss conformity over. He is very assertive, yet he's very apathetic. Ron is portrayed as this kind of man's man. He's a super libertarian, really doesn't believe in the government, yet he's in a position of authority throughout most of the show in the government. Now, this is a great example of compliance, especially in this episode called Live Ammo from season 4. Despite Ron's, outward hatred for the government, his hatred for kind of hippie culture, so to speak, so things like meditation and vegetarianism, whatever you want to call it, he still goes along to a meditation session with his boss, Chris, as part of the selection process to become the assistant city manager. Now, why he does that, that's a whole other discussion, but that's a good example of compliance. Ron doesn't believe in what he's doing, but he still does it because Chris asked him to. Descriptive norms, in this episode called Article 2, Ron is experimenting on a coworker named Jerry, who we'll talk about in a little bit here. And Ron says that he believes that there are only 3 ways to motivate someone: fear, money, and hunger. I thought this is a good example of a descriptive norm because Ron is expressing his held descriptive norms about what others believe, what motivates others, his perception of the other. Lastly, when we talk about reactance, which again is kind of acting out to protect your own personal freedoms, a cornerstone of Ron's characters is again his hatred for the government. And there are several occasions where he goes against the kind of norm and goes against the rules in these acts of kind of micro rebellion. The picture there is a baseball bat that he shoved into the wall because he was upset about something the government did. But there are often, not quite as violent little rebellions that Ron makes with varied results, often comedic. Moving on to persuasion here. Persuasion is simply the process of influencing or attempting to influence someone's attitudes, their beliefs, their behaviors, whatever, through communication or other forms of influence. We may know it as debate, argument, something like that. But persuasion is this kind of overarching category here. There are many routes for persuasion. Not many. There's 2 main routes. There's the central and the peripheral route that are generally regarded as the 2 primary courses we can take. Central route is more for your more well-informed, well-educated audiences. It appeals to science and reason and logic, that kind of thing. Very much evidence-backed debate there. The peripheral route is almost precisely the opposite. It's very flashy, it's very superficial. This would be something like having an attractive spokesperson or a catchy phrase, something like that would make an appeal to the peripheral route. We're going to talk about the peripheral route with the character I've selected here. The sleeper effect is a phenomenon in which we may receive a persuasive message at one time, and it may not persuade us in that moment, but later on in the future, it may come back to us, kind of reactivate this dormant message that we received and influence our behavior after the passage of time. This could be like a catchy catchphrase, sticking in your head and coming up when you need a plumber, something like that, right? And lastly, there are several strategies to persuasion. We're going to talk about the foot in the door strategy here, which is simply, it's predicated over this belief that if you get your audience to agree to a small, harmless request, you can kind of step up the magnitude of your requests and make progressively larger and more outlandish requests. And presumably because your foot was already in the door, it's easier to get it open, so to speak. Now, Tom Haverford is a great character to look at when we're talking about persuasion. He's very bold and he's bon vivant, which is a phrase meaning that he enjoys the finer things in life. Tom is all about the peripheral route, no matter what he's doing in the show. He's very much portrayed as being this kind of not quite sleazy, but kind of self-interested businessman. He's always looking for the next big thing. He's very superficial, as I mentioned. In season 3, he and his friend John Ralphio, who I wish I had a spot for in this presentation, they've formed this company that they describe as a multimedia entertainment conglomerate. They don't know what the company does. They don't know what it's supposed to do, and no one else does, but they advertise it very well using purely peripheral routes of persuasion. In their commercials, they're always flashing money, they're partying, there's girls, there's cars, everything like that, and that is a perfect example of peripheral persuasion. The sleeper effect, it's a little more nuanced of a take here, but in the series finale, the show ends with kind of a really optimistic and bright kind of look into the future for all of the main characters in the show. And in Tom's future, it's revealed that, all of his businesses fail, and he's always trying again. And later on, he does find his success, but it's only through the lessons he learns through all of those failures. And I thought that this was a good example of the sleeper effect because Tom didn't learn his lessons at the moment of failure. It was only after 5, 10 failed businesses that these kind of dormant messages that he's collected over the years kind of reactivate and teach him something, and he's finally able to make his mark on the world. And lastly, the foot in the door phenomenon, we see this throughout multiple episodes with Tom. He's always portrayed, like I said, as kind of a sleazy businessman, a good negotiator. He has a lot of powerful friends that he's able to get to do things for him through the foot in the door strategy. He may request a small favor and then a larger favor, and then before you know it, I think in one episode, he gets somebody to donate like 15 buses to a political campaign he's helping with, something like that. And I thought that's a great example of that. Moving on to aggression. Aggression is simply behavior that is intended to harm or injure another individual or group. This is not just physical aggression, there's also verbal aggression, social aggression, all kinds of different types, which we'll talk about in a moment here. Relational versus physical aggression refers to kind of the two main umbrellas under which all other aggression can fall. Physical aggression is that direct physical harm, that would be things like, physically attacking somebody, assault, that kind of thing. Whereas relational aggression is just the practice of damaging somebody's social environment, social relationships. That would be something like insulting somebody, spreading rumors, that would be considered relational aggression. Instrumental aggression refers to a further specification of aggressive behavior in which we can identify the purpose of the aggression. There either is or there isn't purpose. Instrumental aggression is aggression that is intended to achieve a larger goal. This could be bullying somebody because you want, you're jealous of them and you want their social status or something like that. Lastly, frustration is this kind of more nuanced. I refer to, or I think of it as kind of dormant aggression or lesser aggression. And frustration stems from this emotional response we have when our goals are frequently blocked. So this again is kind of slow buildup of anger and frustration over time. Experiencing frustration increases our readiness to act aggressively. If we're frustrated, we are more likely to act aggressively in the future. The perfect example of aggression is this character called Jeremy Jam. He is very adversarial and very aggressive throughout most of the show. He does have some redeeming qualities, but that's beyond the scope of this presentation today. Now, when it comes to relational and physical aggression, a great example of this is there is a wedding occurring between Leslie and Ben, not to spoil their arc, but it's kind of a surprise wedding. And Jam, who is always portrayed as kind of the antagonist of whatever episode he's in, he shows up and he's mad about something related to the plot, and he crashes the wedding. And he's walking around saying, boo Leslie, nope, you suck, this wedding's horrible, all that kind of stuff. And that's a great example of relational aggression. In this very same scene, we also see an example of physical aggression in the form of retaliation from Ron. Ron gets fed up with Jam's antics, and he walks up and punches him square in the mouth, breaks his tooth, and the show carries on. So that's a good example of both kind of categories of aggression there. When it comes to instrumental aggression, really all of Jam's character and all of his aggression, all of his belligerence, it's all revealed to be, or not really revealed, but it's all just moving him towards a larger goal. He's very self-motivated. He's often after more money, more power, but sometimes he's even being aggressive for things as simple as an office with a private bathroom. But the point to take away here is that all of his aggression was intended to reach a larger goal, or move him towards a larger goal. Lastly, with frustration, there's a very humanizing moment in Season 5 in which Jam is very transparent with the gang, and he reveals that part of the reason he's been so terrible to everybody and so problematic of a character is because he's just jealous that the gang is always winning. He feels like it's always them against him, and he feels like he can never win. And this is a great example of frustration because throughout the series, he uses this frustration to justify his aggressive behavior there, which is seen as making it easier for him to act so terribly. Moving towards prejudice here. Prejudice is simply these preconceived beliefs, attitudes, notions, judgments, whatever, about individuals or groups or people groups based purely on their group identity. Now, this can be something as simple as race, that's the most common form of prejudice, but it can also be related to religion. You may even have prejudice beliefs about certain types of people, so to speak. You may believe that all people who are intellectually inferior to you, by whatever definition you carry, can all be treated the same way, etc. Now, within prejudice, there is the act of discrimination, which is the unfair treatment of members of a certain group based on their group identity. Like I said, we'll talk about that in a moment. There's stereotyping, which are these preconceived, oversimplified, and often incorrect beliefs that we hold about specific people or groups of people, based purely, again, on their group affiliation there. And then lastly, microaggression are these subtle and sometimes unintentional mistreatment of people based, again, on their group. Now, microaggression is different from that big aggression we just talked about because it's not always overt. You may not even know that you're committing a microaggression when you are. This could be something as simple as, instead of, large aggression might be punching someone in the face. Microaggression could be when you walk past someone in the hallway, you bump into them and you don't apologize, or you make some unintentionally disparaging remark about somebody. That would be considered microaggression. Gary Gergich is a great character to talk about this concept with, but he is not the instigator of these aggressions. He is often the victim of prejudice. He's a very gentle and good-natured character, but he is kind of the show's punching bag, the scapegoat. For some reason, the gang and the rest of the world just doesn't like him, and you never really find out why. A good example of discrimination is in season 5's episode titled Ron and Diane. Jerry is throwing a beautiful Christmas party at his beautiful home with his beautiful family, because everything in Jerry's life is great except for how others treat him. And some of the other characters are excluded from this party, and it's later revealed that the reason for that is because they have been blocking his emails for several years. This is discrimination because, purely based on who Gary is, they decided that they don't want to give him an opportunity to communicate with them. When it comes to stereotyping, in the same season, there's an episode in which Jerry retires, and this sparks all kinds of tension in the office about who will replace him, not in terms of work duty, but in terms of being the office Jerry, which is a stereotype they create to describe the office scapegoat, the office punching bag, the fool, the bumbling idiot, the dunce, all that kind of stuff. And that's a great stereotype because what's it founded on? Really nothing, right? They just decide that someone has to be the stereotypical idiot, and that title should belong to Jerry. And then lastly, in terms of microaggression, in the opening episode of season 3, the government has just come back from a several month long shutdown, and Leslie is kind of running around in this opening, this cold open, kind of getting the gang back together. Jerry is seen painting a wonderful painting by a lake, and Leslie just kind of picks it up and says, "Jerry, you don't need this anymore," and throws it into the lake. Doesn't even think about it. That's microaggression because Leslie may not have intended to be so rude and so mean to Jerry. She didn't know the effect that would have on him, but he did. And she committed it simply because, oh, it's just Jerry, he'll be fine. He's, just some silly painting, right? All right, almost done here. We're on the second to last category, moving on to liking, loving, and connecting. This is simply, can't really simplify this anymore. It's just the social psychological phenomenon responsible for why we like, love, and connect with others. Similarity refers to the fact that we are more likely to find connections with people we find similar. Proximity refers to the fact that it's easier to connect with others if we're often in close proximity with each other. You're not going to fall in love with a stranger that lives in another country, but you may fall in love with your coworker. And competence, kind of inversely, some people think that intelligence is attractive, and it may be, but we do find that those that we perceive as more competent sometimes can be seen as less attractive because they may be intimidating to us. A great example of all of these things, and really my favorite relationship in the show, is April and Andy Dwyer. They are upbeat and unconventional, respectively. Now, they are polar opposite characters in terms of personality. April is very dark, very brooding, very much walks her own path. Andy's like a puppy. He's dumb. He's happy all the time. Everyone loves him. He's such a lovable guy. Despite their kind of clashing personalities, it's their similar social standings that create such a great chemistry between them. They both kind of walk their own paths. They both don't really fit in with the group, but they fit in with each other, and that's all that counts. When we talk about proximity, season 2, episode 10, called Hunting Trip, most of the gang is away on a hunting trip, and April and Andy are kind of left alone in the office. This is when they first meet, and this is when the audience first is introduced to the idea that, hey, maybe this could be a couple here. And it's simply because they're in this kind of enclosed office environment throughout the entirety of the episode, spanning several hours, in real life, so to speak, that creates these kind of sparks and this initial attraction between the two. And lastly, the pratfall effect, which is ironic because, Andy's played by Chris Pratt, so I had to make the pratfall effect something we talk about. This is simply a theory that states that, people who we observe making mistakes or observe making errors are more attractive to us because it's kind of humanizing, it's disarming. And a good example of this is in season 5. April is away on a work trip. She's staying an extended time in Washington, D.C. And Andy, ever the idiot, mails her all of his laundry because he doesn't know how to do his laundry. And, ordinarily this would be very strange behavior, but April is brought to tears, happy tears, because of how much she loves Andy. And this is a great example of the pratfall effect here. Lastly, we're going to talk about altruism to finish things up here. Altruism is just a general term for selfless, voluntary acts of kindness that are often intended to benefit others, and they often either don't benefit us or sometimes even cost us by acting altruistically. There are many types of altruism, but we're going to talk about pure altruism, which is kindness for the sake of kindness, altruism for the sake of altruism. There are no incentives, there's no obvious reward. This is very different from reciprocal altruism, group-based flavors of altruism, etc. Release refers to the fact that altruism is sometimes used as a method for releasing internal tension. It can be very cathartic. Often the best way to get rid of internal conflict is by giving more of yourself to others. And then impact refers to the fact that engaging in altruism often carries many mental and physical benefits, depending on who you ask and the studies you read. I think the perfect example of altruism is Chris Traeger. He is very positive. He's very personal. He's constantly upbeat. He's kind of the perfect man in the show. So an example of pure altruism, really all of Chris's altruism is pure. He's never really seen asking for anything in return. But a great example is in season 3. He's still the newer character in this episode. The camera has just cut from one scene to a scene involving Chris, and all that we are seeing is him finishing up a very deep and impactful and personal conversation with some woman on a bench. She walks away, she's crying, she's super grateful, she thanks him profusely. One of the other characters asks Chris, who was she? Why was she upset? And he says, I don't know. She seemed upset, so I thought I should help. That's pure altruism. He didn't ask for anything in return. He didn't even know her. An example of release is in season 3, episode 1, titled Go Big or Go Home. He's on his first date with Anne. Anne asks Chris why he's always so positive, and he reveals that it comes from a place of darkness. He had a very stressful, intense childhood. He was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and all of this kind of negativity in his past, he releases by acting so kind to others. It's very cathartic for him. And lastly, but not least, is the impact of this altruistic behavior. Chris is always portrayed as being the bionic man. It's said that he has a heart so strong he could pump fuel into a jet plane. He can run a 4-minute mile, etc. And we as the audience are kind of made to draw these connections between his altruistic behavior and his impeccable physical health. He's not always in great mental shape, but later on he kind of finds a therapist and is. But again, we can see that Chris's kindness maybe not be proven to be a result of his or result in his physical health, but we certainly draw these connections between them. With that being said, we're going to end up things here. Thank you very much for your time, and goodbye.